So, hello everyone, and welcome to another Formal Languages in Neural Network seminar. Today we'll hear from Brian DuSell, a PhD student of David Chang at University of Notre Dame. And today's talk will be about non-deterministic stacks in neural networks. And it's a follow-up on their new paper called The Surprising Computational Powers of Non-Deterministic Stacked RNNs. And Brian, thank you for presenting your exciting work today. And so everyone, please welcome Brian, and you can take it from here, Brian.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. So hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to give you this talk today, and thank you for coming. So my name is Brian DuSell, and I'm a PhD candidate at Notre Dame in my last year. And there I work with my advisor, David Chang, who many of you know, in the natural language processing group. And today I'll be giving a talk about my dissertation research, which involves incorporating non-deterministic stacks into neural networks. So here's a brief overview of what I'll be talking about today. So first, I'll start by discussing exactly what a non-deterministic stack is and why that's something we'd be interested in putting in our neural networks in the first place. And in a nutshell, it's motivated by wanting to recognize context-free patterns in natural language. And then I'll cover the techniques we use for combining non-deterministic stacks with RNNs. And I'll discuss some theoretical results and some experiments showing that non-deterministic stack RNNs can recognize all context-free languages. And finally, I'll end by discussing some recent work we've done showing that non-deterministic stack RNNs can even recognize many non-context-free languages, including cross-serial dependencies. And if you're curious, this talk encompasses 3 papers that I published with David over the past couple of years. The first 2 focus mainly on experimenting with non-deterministic stack RNNs on CFLs. And the third one, which we've just recently written, includes the experiments on non-CFLs. So I'm going to start totally from scratch for this talk, so no background knowledge on stack RNNs is required. So I'm going to start by reiterating some very basic concepts that hopefully all of you are familiar with. So the first is, what is a stack? So a data structure, a stack is a data structure. It's fundamental in computer science, and it's a container that acts like a stack of dinner plates. So you can push new items on top, you can pop the thing that's on top of the stack and remove it, and you can't access anything that's beneath the top without popping it first. So we're talking about non-deterministic stacks. So what is non-determinism? So again, non-determinism is a fundamental concept from automata theory. And we can see this in the distinction between deterministic and non-deterministic finite automata. So if you think about DFAs, for any given configuration in a DFA, there's always exactly one choice of next transition that you can execute. And the machine accepts its input string if and only if the last state is an accept state. Contrast this with a non-deterministic finite automaton, which given one configuration can have any number of choices of transition to take. And when it makes multiple choices, it can branch into these sort of parallel universes. And the machine is sent to accept the input if and only if any branch ends in an accept state. So what is a non-deterministic stack? So more precisely, what I'm talking about is non-deterministic pushdown automata, or PDAs. So a pushdown automaton is just a finite state control attached to a stack data structure. And again, we can have both deterministic PDAs or non-deterministic PDAs. So in a DPDA, there's exactly one possible next transition for any configuration. And in a non-deterministic PDA, or just PDA for short, we can have any number of possible next actions. And if you encounter some ambiguity, then you branch into parallel universes, each with its own instance of its stack. And we're interested in non-deterministic PDAs because they recognize the class of context-free languages, which is relevant to natural language. All right, so why do we want these things in our neural networks? Well, for one, they offer better expressivity. So if you think about a standard RNN, like an Elman RNN or an LSTM, if you implement it with finite precision, it's really equivalent to just a really big finite automaton. And theoretically, it will fail to recognize simple languages like W marker, W reverse. if the strings are long enough, because it won't have enough capacity to memorize the string W. So there's been some prior work on combining deterministic stacks with RNNs, but what we're focusing on this work is that that's really not enough. So if you want a type of RNN that can truly recognize all context-free languages, you really need to add a non-deterministic PDA to the RNN, because unlike the case with finite automata, deterministic pushdown automata are strictly less powerful than non-deterministic pushdown automata. And we think this is important for natural language because natural language is full of syntactic ambiguity. So we would like a model that can handle that nicely. Another reason we like non-deterministic stacks is we hope it'll result in better learning. So if you're dealing with hierarchically structured data like syntax and natural language, it's nice to have a model that has an inductive bias for those kinds of structures. And there's been some work showing that even large language models don't always learn to generalize on language syntax in a way that matches the way that humans would. People have also shown that RNNs struggle with hierarchically structured data unless they have some sort of explicit syntactic supervision in the form of parse trees, or if they have some hierarchical inductive bias like tree data structures or stacks. All right, so first let me make the case for stacks in general, a natural language. So the goal of our work is to improve the performance of RNNs on sequential data that have hierarchical patterns, including natural language syntax. And we can see hierarchical structure in this sentence, which contains an example of center embedding. So the sentence we have here is, the diamond that the thief with the red hat stole glittered. Now, stacks can help us process hierarchical structures as shown here. So for the purposes of this example, let's assume that the human sentence processing model just pushes subject noun phrases to the stack, and it pops them whenever their matching verb is encountered. So in this case specifically, we see the subject diamond, we push it to the stack, and then we encounter the subject thief, and we push that on top of the stack. And then finally, we get to the verb stole. And because thief is on top of the stack, we know that matches with stole. So then we pop thief from the stack, and then we see glittered, and we know that that matches with diamond. And the stack gives us an easy way to recognize this sort of nested syntactic structure. All right, so now I would like to make a case for non-determinism in particular. And I'd like to do this by using this completely real headline that I found in 2020. And I'll give you all a few seconds to try to read and parse the sentence, because when I first saw this, it made me do a double take. So I'll give you a few moments to read this. All right, so the sentence is, Green Bay Packers fan shut down amid Wisconsin COVID explosion stings Trump. So does anyone want to venture a guess of what this is supposed to mean? No? All right, so I'll in a couple slides, I'll give my best guess as to what this is intended to mean. The reason I bring up this example is because it illustrates cases in which we expect non-determinism to help in natural language. Because natural language is full of syntactic ambiguity. And there are realistic examples of sentences where if you're reading from left to right, it's not immediately clear what even the main verb in the sentence is. So what we should do is keep track of multiple stacks of syntactic states until we have enough information to decide which interpretation is correct. All right, so there are at least two plausible parses that I can think of that are active until the last two words, if you're reading from left to right. So I don't know about you, but when I read the sentence the first time, I thought that the main verb was the word fan, like you're fanning something. So I tried to parse the sentence as follows. the subject is Green Bay Packers, and we push it to the stack to match it with its verb later, and we immediately see the verb fan, so we pop the stack. And then the object of the verb fan is this phrase, shut down amid Wisconsin COVID explosion. All right, so we have our object, but then we reach the word stings and we don't know what to do with it. It doesn't make grammatical sense. It seems like a verb, but the stack is empty, so we don't have a subject to go with it. And it turns out what I think the correct parse is looks like this. So the main verb is actually stings, and the word fan is a noun, as in football fan. It turns out that the subject is the word shutdown, and we don't pop it from the stack until we see stings at the end of the sentence. And the sentence ends up with a totally different syntactic structure from the previous slide. But this does not mean that the first way of parsing it was wrong, because if only the words stings trump had been left out of the sentence would still have been grammatical, and the first parse would have been the correct one. So what we could do is track multiple parses while reading from left to right and discard ones that don't make sense later on. And some psycholinguistic models of sentence processing suggest that humans actually do track multiple parses at once like this. So this way of processing is equivalent to performing different stack operations at the same time. And this is where the non-determinism comes into play. It lets us perform multiple operations at once. So when we see the phrase Green Bay Packers, we start two versions of the stack, one where we push Green Bay Packers as if it were the subject, and one where we do nothing. And then we do the same thing when we see shutdown. We start a version of the stack where we push it as the subject, and another where we assume it's an object and do nothing. And when we see the word stings, only the orange version of the stack is consistent with the sentence, so we end up using that. All right, so now I'm going to move on to talking about how we combine stacks with recurrent neural networks. So all the neural networks we're going to be talking about in this talk are recurrent neural networks. So I'm only going to be focusing on what are called differentiable stacks. So we're not using reinforcement learning or anything like that. The reason we like differentiable stacks is because they can just be easily plugged into an RNN, and then the whole network can be trained with simple backpropagation. So the differentiable stack is not itself a discrete stack data structure, but it's more like you can think of it as a simulation of a discrete stack. And there are three main styles in the literature so far, which we call stratification, superposition, and our work, which is on non-determinism. All right, so each stack RNN, including our own, has the same basic structure. So it consists of an RNN called the controller connected to a differentiable stack data structure. And to simplify this discussion, I've shown an RNN connected to an ordinary discrete stack for now. So at each time step, the RNN sends what's called an action to the stack. And this is a command to push or pop an element. Then the action is performed. So an element is added or removed. And the stack then returns the top element of the stack as an extra input to the controller at the next time step. And we call this the stack reading. So there are two places where the controller and the stack interface. One is the stack actions, and the second is the stack readings. Now, in reality, we use differentiable stacks, not discrete stacks. So to do this, to make this work, we have to make the actions and readings fractional values so that they are differentiable. So we don't actually use a discrete stack in practice. The differentiable stack is just a simulation of a discrete stack, and it approximates it with some continuous and differentiable function. So say what our actions would look like now is instead of performing definite actions to push or pop symbols, the controller outputs a distribution of our actions. And exactly what that distribution looks like, it depends on the style of differentiable stack. But for this example, you could give you could give commands to say mostly push 0 or mostly pop the top symbol. And it's the stack's job to combine these fractional actions into an approximation of the updated stack. Now, after the stack is updated, it should return a vector that represents the updated top element of the stack. We call this the reading vector. So if you mostly push a 0 in the previous time step, then this should return a vector that says that mostly 0 is on top of the stack. Now, the key requirement for differentiable stack data structures is that the reading vector needs to be differentiable with respect to the stack actions. And this way, gradient can flow through the stack RNN end to end during training using ordinary backprop, which makes training quite simple. All right, so there were two main styles of differentiable stack prior to our work. So the first one we'll look at is a model by Das et al. And Sun et al. And later revisited by Greffenstedt et al. And we call this the stratification stack because it represents its elements as these kinds of layers of variable thickness. So the stack elements themselves are vectors, and each is associated with a thickness value between 0 and 1. And a helpful analogy is to think of it as being like a cake, like a wedding cake with layers. And the stack elements are like layers of a cake of varying thickness. So in this case, the actions include a pop signal between 0 and 1, which tells you how much to slice off the top of the cake. And the actions also include a push vector and a push signal between 0 and 1, which is the thickness of the newly pushed vector, which I've illustrated here. And finally, the stack reading that's returned to the controller is formed by looking at the top unit of the stack and interpolating the vectors within it. So it's like you cut off 1 inch off the top of the cake, and you mix everything together, and you see what you get from doing that. And this stack has quadratic space and time complexity with respect to the input length. Okay, the second type of stack is what we call the superposition stack by Julien and Mikolov. Again, in this case, the stack elements are vectors, but they don't have that variable thickness from before. So in this model, the controller actions include a probability distribution over 3 stack operations, which are push, no-op, and pop. And it also includes a pushed vector. And the way it works is like 3 new candidate stacks are computed. One where all the elements have been shifted down, which is for push. One where all elements are the same, which is for no-op. And one where everything has been shifted up by 1, which is for pop. And we then interpolate the 3 stacks according to their respective weights into a kind of superposition of the 3 stacks. And in this case, the stack reading is simply the top vector element after the update. And again, this model has quadratic time and space complexity. All right, so this brings us to our non-deterministic stack. So our motivation for using this is that only non-deterministic pushdown automata recognize all context-free languages. So if you want an RNN that actually recognizes all CFLs, you really need to add a non-deterministic pushdown automaton. Just adding a stack is not enough. And the key idea here is that our so-called differentiable stack, in this case, is a simulation not just of a stack, but of a non-deterministic weighted PDA. And this simulation includes an exponential number of PDA configurations. But I'm going to be showing you techniques that allow us to do this tractably. Now, you can always summarize the status of a pushdown automaton with 3 pieces of information, which are the current input position, the current state, and the contents of the stack. So in pictures, you can think of the simulation as a tree, a big tree of PDA configurations. And in this picture, each configuration consists of a PDA state drawn in a circle, a stack of discrete symbols, drawn as squares, and the time step is listed on the left side. And let's say that the stack initially contains a designated bottom symbol, which is what the upside down T represents. So this picture shows two generations of configurations where only the leftmost configuration is expanded. So many configurations are not shown here because in reality, every configuration would have its own descendants, and you'd have this exponential blowup of configurations. Now, each of these branches corresponds to the application of a specific PDA transition. And I've summarized what a PDA transition looks like on the right. You're always going from one PDA state to another. And I'll mention that the pushdown automaton in this case has its own finite state control that's independent of the RNN. So you predefine some set of states, or rather the number of states, and that's a hyperparameter in this model. So every transition goes from one state to another. It scans an input symbol and it replaces some sequence of symbols on the stack with something else. And either U or V can be empty, which is how you can push or pop elements. So in this picture, here's where you can see applications of push transitions. And I've included multiple combinations of destination state and push symbol, which is why there are multiple descendants for push transitions. Here are the replace transitions, which just replace whatever's on top of the stack. And here are some pop transitions. Now, in our model, the actions that the RNN controller outputs are the weights of the transitions that are used at each time step. Remember, it's a weighted PDA. So these weights end up defining a distribution over different PDA configurations. So each of the configurations in this diagram would have its own weight associated with it. And there's an exponential number of these configurations. All right, so we have this distribution over configurations, but then we need to return a vector of fixed size to the RNN controller. So how do we sort of summarize an exponential number of configurations into a fixed size vector? And the way we were going to do this is we compute a probability distribution over pairs of PDA states and top stack symbols. And we do this by marginalizing out everything that's beneath the top stack symbol. So if we wanted to, say, get a summary of all the configurations at time t+2, then we would only look at the tops, the states and the top symbols of these configurations, and we would marginalize everything beneath the top symbol out. And that would give us a vector that contains a probability for every pair of PDA state and stack symbol type. So are there any questions so far? I'm happy to be interrupted and clarify anything. No? All right, great. So at this point, I just want to take a minute to make sure that the role of the pushdown automaton in this model is very clear. So the RNN controller doesn't interact with this PDA directly because the PDA can exist in a very large number of different configurations. What the RNN interacts with is a simulation of the PDA's non-deterministic branches. So it affects simulation by sending PDA transition weights into it, and the simulation talks back to the controller by giving it that marginal distribution, which summarizes that distribution over configurations. And it acts like an oracle that provides information to the controller that it couldn't figure out by itself. So we call this combination of the RNN controller and the non-deterministic PDA simulation a renormalizing non-deterministic stack RNN, or RNS-RNN for short. So the name of our model is the RNS-RNN. And the name, the reason for the name renormalizing isn't too important for this talk, but if you're curious, it's related to the fact that the transition weights are not normalized sum to 1. All right, so now I need to talk about the details of the pushdown automaton that we are simulating. So quick definitions. We use Q for the set of states. We use sigma for the input alphabet, gamma for the stack alphabet, delta for the weighted transitions, and Q0 for the initial state. And in our version, let's say there's also a designated bottom symbol in gamma, which is the initial symbol on the stack. And for the purposes of this talk, let's also say that to determine acceptance of a string, we'll define a set of pairs of states and top stack symbols. And this more closely resembles the way an RNN could decide to accept or reject a string. It could observe both the state and the stack symbol. Not too important, but it just makes it a little cleaner. All right, I talked about transitions a bit already. So the meaning of a transition like this is that if the current state is Q, and if the next input symbol is A, and if the top of the stack is the string U, then pop U and push the string V, go to state R, and do all this with weight W. I want to go over a couple of definitions now too. So formally, a PDA configuration is a triple IQ beta, where I is the current input position in the input string, Q is the current state, and beta is the contents of the stack. And the initial configuration is 0Q0 bottom symbol. And now I need to define something called a run. So a run is simply any valid sequence of transitions. And we say that the weight of a run is the product of the weights of its transitions. And multiple runs, distinct runs, can end in the same configuration. So you could say, replace a symbol, or you could push a symbol and then pop a symbol. You end up with the same stack height. So if we're talking about configurations, we say that the weight of a configuration is the sum of the weights of all the runs that end in it. Now, I need to discuss some extra restrictions that we place on our PDAs. And the reason we do this is to make our lives a lot easier in implementation down the road. So the first restriction is that the PDA is always real time, which means that all transitions are scanning. The second restriction is that transitions are always restricted to one of three forms, where X and Y are stack symbols. So we have a push symbol, or sorry, we have a push form, which pushes symbol Y on top of X. We have a replace form, which just replaces the top. And we have a pop form, which just gets rid of a symbol entirely. So we call this the restricted form for PDAs. And note that all the transitions here are always conditioned on a top stack symbol X. But importantly, even though we have these restrictions, we still allow transitions to be non-deterministic. So it's okay to have multiple choices leading out of the same configuration. All right, so some quick examples of how you would write PDAs like this. So this is for the language we call marked reversal, which is W marker symbol W reverse, where W is a binary string. So with a restricted PDA, you could push W to the stack, then you see the marker symbol, and then you just pop everything in reverse when you're in the second half. And the bottom symbol here means that we accept only if the bottom symbol is on top of the stack. Here's another example, which is non-deterministic. So here we have the same language, but with the marker symbol removed, which forces us to non-deterministically guess where the split point is. So we push the symbols in W, and at any point, we can make one of these transitions that goes to the next state. All right, so you might be wondering at this point, with these restrictions, do we end up with less powerful PDAs? In other words, is there going to be a CFL that we can't write a restricted PDA for? And it turns out the answer is actually no. And this is something that we proved in our latest paper. So it turns out you can always convert a CFL through Greibach normal form into a restricted PDA. Now, I want to reiterate the fact that the actions that are output by the controller and sent to the PDA simulation are the weights of the transitions. So the controller outputs a weight for every possible transition in restricted form. And this gives us 2 times q squared gamma squared plus q squared gamma weights in total. And note that these transitions are generated from the hidden state. So they are implicitly conditioned on the current input symbol. So that's why I didn't write an input symbol in these transitions here. But the weights can also depend on anything else that's encoded in the hidden state, including previous inputs or previous stack readings. Another quick note is that we found that this works best when the weights are unnormalized positive weights, not probabilities. All right, so now I've discussed mathematically what we're doing with our non-deterministic stack, but now we need to discuss how we actually do it. So the obvious problem is that if you're simulating a non-deterministic model, we're going to have to track an exponential number of configurations. So how do we do this tractably? And the answer is to use a dynamic programming algorithm for PDAs called Lang's algorithm. So the key idea here is to pack this distribution of stacks into a graph with weighted edges, where the edges represent stack symbols. And we can do this with quadratic space and cubic time, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise if you're familiar with CFG parsing with like early or CKY. So the way Lang's algorithm works is it exploits structural similarities in PDA runs. So the first is that multiple runs can end in the same exact configuration. And the second is that if you have a stack of height k, then you know that it must have been derived from a stack of height k minus 1. So in principle, the only information you need to represent a stack of height k is to store its top stack symbol and to store a pointer to the old stack of height k minus 1. So the data structure we end up with is a weighted directed graph where edges represent individual symbols on the stack, and paths in the graph, of which there are exponentially many, represent full stacks. And we can equivalently view this graph as a weighted non-deterministic finite automaton, which encodes what would be considered the weighted language of all possible stacks at the current time step. And for this reason, we call this data structure the stack WFA. So you might be interested to learn that, if you don't know already, that for PDAs, at any time step, the set of all possible stacks is always a regular language, even if there's an infinite number. And Lang's algorithm just gives us an explicit construction for its NFA. If you're familiar, by the way, with like GLR or Tomita parsing for CFGs, this is a lot like the packed shared parse forest. All right, so now I'm going to start discussing the details of this stack WFA data structure. And when I usually give this talk, I try to shy away from the technical details here, but because this is a theory-oriented audience, I'm going to go for it today. So in the stack WFA, every state is a triple that consists of a time step I, a PDA state Q, and a top stack symbol X. And the stack WFA has transitions from one state to another, and I'll discuss what the meaning of a transition is. But if you think of it as like this packed directed graph, the symbol Y here is the thing that is the stack symbol that labels the edge. All right, so to understand the stack WFA, I need to discuss a concept called push computations. And this is actually a fairly simple concept, but it's essential for understanding what the structure of the stack WFA is. So let's define a push computation for the symbol Y as any run that has the total effect of pushing one Y to the stack without ever exposing the stack. Right, so it represents a sequence of transitions that looks something like this. So we start with some stack, we push something on top of it, and we can push more stuff and pop things later. The only requirement is that we end up with a single Y on top of the old stack. And crucially, we never go below this dashed line here. So what the stack WFA represents is a logical equivalence between these push computations in the PDA and these transitions in the stack WFA. So we're just saying that if the PDA does something like this, then we're going to represent this as this edge in the stack WFA. So are there any questions at this point? This is one of the hairiest parts of the talk, so I'm happy to stop and answer questions. All right, great. So I'll keep going. So now the question is, how do we build the stack WFA? So Lang's algorithm is all about efficiently building the stack WFA incrementally, and this process can be summed up with 4 basic inference rules. So in this diagram, each row is an inference rule with a PDA transition on the left and a stack WFA fragment on the right. So each rule means that if the PDA contains the transition to the left, then we add the dashed parts of the fragment on the right to the full stack WFA. And this representation of the algorithm is purely functional. It doesn't specify the order in which to apply these rules, and nothing is ever deleted or changed destructively. It's just a nice, concise way of defining the essence of Lang's algorithm. So another important detail is that when we add new edges, they always have updated weights, which are calculated by multiplying together the transition weights that are involved in the inference rule. Also, we also need to apply every rule for every possible value of the free variables in the rule. Okay, so let's look at how each of these rules works intuitively. So we have an axiom rule, which just starts by adding the bottom symbol to the stack. All right, so far so good. That clearly is a push computation in the PDA. The next is the push rule, which works by growing the stack by adding a single edge. And again, it's pretty clear that that qualifies as a very simple push computation, just one transition long. Next, we have the replace rule, which works by looking at some existing edge in the graph and adding a new edge with the replacement symbol and the updated weight. And finally, we have the pop rule, which is the most complex, and it works by looking 2 symbols down the stack. And it creates a new transition with the top symbol removed, but with the symbol underneath it preserved with an updated weight. So these rules help us analyze what the space and time complexity of this algorithm should be. So to determine space complexity, we just look at how many different stack WFA transition weights will we need to store. So a transition is a pair of states, which gives us 2 variables, I and t for time steps, 2 variables for states, and 2 stack symbols. So that tells us that the space complexity should be q squared, gamma squared, n squared. As for the time complexity, we look at the number of different ways we can instantiate each rule given its free variables. So the most expensive rule in our case is the pop rule, which has 4 states, 3 stack symbols, and 3 time steps. So this tells us the time complexity would be q to the 4th, gamma cubed, n cubed. But nicely, in a paper we just published at EMNLP, we figured out a trick where we can actually improve the time complexity by pre-computing the product of the pop transition and the top stack symbol. So the details aren't too important here, but we get a nice speed up by a factor of q here. And empirically, we see that this actually does help training time a very large amount. So at this point, I want to talk about some crucial implementation and engineering details. And these are things we didn't spend a lot of time talking about in our paper, but they were nonetheless very important for getting this model to work in the first place. So the first detail is that we need to do all these computations in log space to avoid overflow and underflow. And this is especially important when using unnormalized weights. Otherwise, we'll definitely encounter overflow. The other detail is that we had to come up with a way to convince PyTorch to update the table of stacked WFA weights in place. So we allocate one tensor at the beginning, and then we update it incrementally column by column. And if we used PyTorch's suggested behavior, we would end up with end of the fourth space and time complexity, because it would be making copies of the whole table at every time step. So we came up with a way to convinced PyTorch to actually do things in place while still being correct mathematically, and that got us down to the optimal space complexity. All right, so one more crucial detail is that we implemented the model with efficient parallelizable tensor operations. And I definitely don't expect you to digest any of the math here. The only thing I want to point out is that the formulas for computing the stacked WFA weights have these sum of products. And these sum of products can be represented as einsum operations. So you might be familiar with the einsum operation from like NumPy or PyTorch. It's just a nice tensor operation that does these sum of products. So what we did was we wrote a custom PyTorch einsum function which supports log space, which was really important. And it also splits the operation into chunks to avoid running out of GPU memory. That was also really important. And this was nice because it let us optimize all the most expensive parts of the model at once. All right, so we're getting to the end of how our model works. So to recap, this is what our overall non-deterministic stack RNN architecture looks like. So again, the controller outputs these PDA transition weights at each time step. And these can depend on the current input symbol or anything else in the hidden state, such as previous inputs or stack readings. And we have the stack WFA data structure, which maintains a distribution over PDA configurations. And we continually marginalize over these configurations to get the reading vector, which summarizes the tops of the PDA configurations. And I'm skipping some details how to do the marginalization, but it's pretty straightforward to do it when we have all the stacked WFA weights. All right, so now I'd like to talk about the recognition power of RNNs. So the way I solved this was, if we do this technique, we'll be able to recognize all CFLs. So here's the proof of that. We already know that restricted PDAs recognize all CFLs. So we can always convert a restricted PDA to an RNN by making the controller implement a transition lookup table that depends only on the input symbol. So it acts exactly like a normal PDA. One caveat is that this assumes that we can set some connection weights to negative infinity to allow weights of exactly 0. But unlike normal RNNs, we don't need a couple of assumptions for this to work. So we don't need to assume that we have infinite precision, and we also don't need to give our model extra time steps in order for this to work. So it really is a real-time model. If you execute it on the input with exactly one step per input symbol, then you can make a decision at the end whether or not the string is in a CFL. And it's like we're combining pushdown automata with the power of neural networks. Another motivation for using non-determinism, which might be clearer now, is that it can actually help learning even for deterministic tasks. So unlike the earlier superposition stack, we're not blurring different configurations of stacks together, but we're maintaining a distribution over entire runs. So This means that every possible run of the PDA contributes to the objective function, and good ones will get rewarded. So non-determinism is useful not just for expressivity for non-deterministic CFLs, but also for learning DCFLs. All right, so time for some experiments. So we first ran this model on context-free languages to see how it fares. So to do this, we sampled 10,000 training examples from a PCFG, plus some strings for validation and testing. And the metric we used was we measured the difference between the model's learned distribution over strings and the true distribution that the strings were sampled from. So we call this metric the difference in cross entropy, where lower is better, 0 is the optimal score, and units are in nats. So it's like bits, but base E instead of base 2. All right, so we compared 4 different models, an LSTM baseline, a stratification stack, a superposition stack, and our non-deterministic stack. So on the left here, I have a plot which shows the validation cross entropy as a function of training time. And the right is performance on the test set binned by string length. And again, lower is better. So the first task we tested on was this marked reversal task. So we have a string, a marker symbol, and then the string in reverse. And this is the most simple deterministic CFL. First, note that the LSTM can't even get optimal validation cross entropy, which suggests that the LSTM by itself isn't expressive enough to learn this language. But on the other hand, all the stack models do this pretty easily. Next, we have the unmarked reversal task, which is the same language without the marker symbol. So the model needs to non-deterministically guess where the split point is. And in this case, our model clearly does a lot better than the baseline stack RNNs. We also tried a similar task, which we call padded reversal. So this is the same thing, but we made it more likely for the symbols in the middle to be the same symbol. And this just makes it harder to find the split point based on local palindromes. And this is another case where our model beats the other stack RNNs. So again, our model is the pink line, and it's lower than everything else. Next, we tested on the DEEC language, which is the language of balanced brackets with 2 bracket types. And this is another deterministic task, and it turns out to be really, really easy for all of these stack models. And last but not least, we tested a language known as the hardest context-free language, which is was presented in a paper by Sheila Greibach. And it's the hardest CFL in the sense that an efficient parser for this language is, by construction, an efficient parser for every other CFL. And the way it works is by cutting up a string of balanced brackets, which are shown here highlighted in green, and then hiding it within a bunch of decoy strings, like needles in a haystack. And again, we see that our non-deterministic stack works a lot better than the baseline stack RNNs. All right, so conclusions from these experiments, we saw that the RNS-RNN is consistently the best at learning non-deterministic CFLs, and it's also very good at learning DCFLs as well. We also did include some experiments on natural language. Here we have perplexity scores on the Penn tree bank, and these are not meant to be state-of-the-art results, but just to get an idea of the relative performance of stack RNNs. These are the best of 10 random restarts, and we see that an RNS-RNN with 4 states and 5 stack symbol types, which is the last row, gets the best test perplexity, slightly beating the superposition stack. All right, so in this last part of the talk, I'd like to discuss some work we've done for a paper we've recently written. So the story is, we added this non-deterministic PDA to an RNN to allow to recognize all CFLs, but even this might not be adequate for natural language. So for one, not everything in natural language is context-free, such as cross-serial dependencies in languages like Swiss German or Bambara. So this is a case where like you would have a string, and then you'd see a copy of the string, not in reverse, but in the same order. So this is something that PDAs by themselves can't do. Another problem is that because of the computational cost of our model, we tend to end up with small stack alphabet sizes. But this is probably not enough to store really detailed lexical information on the stack. So, and this is a problem potentially because natural language has large vocabularies. But the surprising finding we made in this paper is that the RNS-RNN is actually really good at overcoming both of these problems. And it all has to do with the way that the stack reading and the RNN controller interact. Because what an RNS-RNN can do that a PDA can't is it can coordinate parallel PDA runs. It can get runs to talk to each other. So in a normal PDA, you have this strict logical disjunction over all runs when you decide to accept a string. But with an RNS-RNN, you can actually examine the status of multiple PDA runs through the stack reading and then use that to update future transition weights. So in the case of recognizing non-context-free languages like cross-serial dependencies, this ability allows you to essentially simulate multiple stacks in parallel. And in fact, we use this fact to prove that an RNS-RNN can recognize all intersections of a finite number of CFLs. And this covers languages like AN, BN, CN, or W marker, W reverse, marker, W. So it turns out that in the case of cross-serial dependencies, so that would be this language W marker W, you can actually recognize this language with an automaton that has access to 3 stacks. So I'm not gonna, I'll quickly go through it. So the way it works is you split the string W into 2 halves. So while reading the first half of the first W, you push the first half to stack 1. While reading the second half, you push that to stack 2, and then you move the symbols from stack 1 to stack 3 in reverse. And then you reach the second half, and when you read the second W, you match the first half with symbols popped from stack 3, right? So now that they've been reversed. And then you do a similar thing with the symbols from stack 2. So you do 2 of these reversals using these multiple stacks. All right, so results on non-context-free languages. So we use the same metric as before, and the models we compared were an LSTM, a superposition stack, and our non-deterministic stack. We also included a version of the superposition stack RNN that is connected to 3 different instances of a stack. So this really is like explicitly modeling a multi-stack automaton. Okay, so we have this language W marker W reverse marker W. So there is a cross-serial dependency here, but this task has 2 hints that are meant to make learning easier. So the first is that it has these explicit boundary markers for the W's, and it has these extra time steps in the middle in the form of W reverse. And it turns out only the multi-stack models, the green and the purple, can solve this task optimally. Now our next language is W marker W. And this is analogous to cross-serial dependencies in Bambara, where in this language, I don't speak this language, but there are like 2 sequences of words, and they're separated by some morpheme O. So this can be solved with 3 tasks, as I showed before. And in this case, only our model solves it. The next language is this W prime, where W is a binary string and W prime is the same string, but every 0 has been replaced with 2 and every 1 has been replaced with 3. So it's the same as W, but the difference is that it has a different vocabulary. And this is analogous to cross-serial dependencies in Swiss German, where the first W would be nouns and the W prime would be verbs that agree with those nouns. And again, only our model solves this. So we're the purple line. All right, and finally, we did test on just WW, which has no hints at all, no explicit marking. And in this case, none of the stack models were able to learn this. All right, so what can we conclude? So for these non-CFLs, only the multi-stack models can learn to copy a string in the pattern of cross-serial dependencies. But only the non-deterministic stack model can learn to copy a string without the help of extra time steps. But without any explicit boundaries, nothing learned to copy a string. All right, last thing is talking about capacity. So this tackles the question, when we're restricted to using a small stack alphabet size in the RNS-RNN, does this limit the amount of information we can pack on the stack? And this seems to be a disadvantage compared to the superposition stack, which can just use vectors to encode symbols as points in a vector space. So like what would happen if we tested an RNS-RNN with only 3 stack symbols on the marked reversal language when W is over an alphabet of 200 symbol types? And the surprising answer is that it actually does really, really well. In fact, it does better than the vector-based superposition stack. And the trick is that it encodes information not in the stack per se, but in the distribution of weights over the stacks. And again, it all has to do with this interaction between the controller and the stack WFA distribution. And what it does is it orchestrates the transition weights in a particular way. So it encodes 200 different symbol types as points in the stack reading, right? So again, the stack reading is a vector, and it just uses that as a vector space. Really briefly, in our latest paper, we introduced a new variant of our model, which is like the RNS-RNN, but the PDA has a stack of vectors instead of just discrete symbols. And the idea here was to combine the benefits of non-determinism and being able to pack many different symbol types into a vector space. So we call this the vector RNS-RNN. So in these experiments, we tried varying the number of symbol types in a task from 2 to 200. And we did this for the marked reversal task and for the DEEC language. And shockingly, the best model here was the basic RNS-RNN, which simulates a discrete stack, not a vector stack. But for the DEEC language, it turns out that our new vector model is the best, which is what we expected. So the pink line is the biggest version of the vector model. So this raises the question, what the heck is going on with the marked reversal language? How is it able to memorize 200 different symbol types if it only has 3 different stack symbol types in the PDA? So again, the stack reading that's returned to the controller is just a vector of probabilities. So we thought maybe it's being used to encode different symbol types in a vector space. So to test this, we extracted stack reading vectors from the second half of strings in the marked reversal language, and we labeled them according to the next symbol that needed to be predicted. And when we put them in a PCA plot, it turns out that, yeah, actually, points cluster together, which means the model is using the stack reading to encode these different symbol types. Finally, we see that these are the same natural language processing results as before, but we added the vector RNS-RNN results, and it turns out that we do slightly edge out the other stack RNNs with our new version of the model. All right, so closing thoughts. So we presented this model, the RNS-RNN, which can recognize all CFLs, But we saw that they can actually go beyond CFLs, including cross-serial dependencies, as long as we have explicit boundaries. We also saw that the RNS-RNN is surprisingly good at encoding large vocabularies in its stack. And we introduced this new model, the vector RNS-RNN, that can combine non-determinism and vector representations. Some limitations of this work. So we have noticed that on some deterministic tasks, the RNS-RNN has trouble generalizing to longer sequences. The model also has pretty high computational cost, although we have been making improvements. So it's steadily getting faster and faster, but it's still cubic time complexity. Also, the gains in natural language modeling are certainly not very large and definitely not state-of-the-art. All right, and that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and I'd be happy to take questions at this point.
Can you go back to the slide of your first non-context-free language result?
Sure.
Was that the one? No.
Oh, non-context free.
Non-context-free language, yeah.
There we go.
So you said that the extra time steps help here. Why is that?
Okay, yeah, it'd be a little easier to explain if I showed a diagram like this, but for the for this language. So the reason it helps is you could solve this with just 2 stacks. So you could push all the symbols in W to stack 1, and then in the middle part, you pop from stack 1 to match with W reverse, and at the same time, you push W reverse to stack 2.
All right.
And then in the last part, you match W.
Fair enough.
Hi, Brian. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question. Very nice work. And, I tried to read your paper and I didn't understand. Now I think I have a much better idea. This is a general question. I wanted to ask you, you are using a special normal form for your PDA where you have push, pop, and replacement. Can you get rid of replacement and just use push and pop and still get all context-free grammars, all context-free languages?
I suspect not, because I'd have to think very carefully about that. I suspect not, because it would be very difficult then to have no-op operations. So a no-op is just a replacement of a symbol with itself. To be really sure, I'd have to sit down with it for a while, but my feeling is no.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Do you have any idea why you have difficulties generalizing to longer strings?
Yeah, so I do have a feeling about that. So I think, and this is an untested hypothesis, but from looking at the weights manually for languages like, going back to the capacity results. So we have this task, W marker, W reverse. So what it looks like is the solution that the model learns is actually not the way you would handwrite a PDA. It's doing something very different and sort of abusing the transition weights. And it seems like it's sort of increasing the values of the weights proportional to the position of the input string. And so it's the optimal solution would be to just use the same weights at every time step based solely on the input symbol, but it looks like it's not doing that. It's doing something else. So where I want to take this work next is to look into ways of regularizing this model and hopefully alleviating that problem.
And do you have an idea about what could be the? I mean, you can more or less recognize some non-context-free languages. How far does this perhaps take you? I mean, if we talk in terms of ordinary discrete models, then if you have two stacks, you can simulate the Turing machine tape, and then there you are. This probably can't be done here, but yeah, do you have any idea about the upper bound?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and we've been thinking about that. And it would correspond to some sort of real-time Turing machine that scans from left to right. So you're right, with two stacks, you can simulate a Turing machine, but that assumes that you have some unbounded number of computation steps. And in this work, we were careful to stick to the assumption that you have exactly n time steps to work with, which is really nice because we now have a model that can recognize all CFLs with that and many non-context-free languages. As for what the actual class of language is, yeah, that's still an open question for us.
Alex?
Oh yeah, hi. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. It's super interesting work. It's kind of follows on from the previous question, really. So you looked at the cases where you can sort of recognize finite of context-free grammars.
Yes.
And then there's a class of grammars called conjunct grammars. I don't know if you come across them, where by Okotin, where you introduce a kind of intersection operation on each production. And he shows that there are languages which you can recognize which correspond to kind of infinite intersections of context-free grammars. And I was wondering if you thought about whether there's a connection with conjunctive grammars rather than context-free grammars.
Yes, I have discussed this with David before. So yeah. We've encountered this paper. I have not read it myself yet, and David has pestered me to take a look at it. But yes, we suspect that it might be related to this model.
Yeah, I mean, I did look at conjunctive grammars fairly closely a while ago, and it's they're like kind of messy in lots of ways, and there are lots of so even if you establish that it's got some relation to conjunct grammars, it might not be that helpful because people well understood. So, but yeah, it was kind of just a possible connection.
Dana, go ahead.
Wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was curious, I guess, about two things. The first is when you say that your weights were log space, and in principle, the weights could be doubling every time unit. What happens when they get past log space? I mean, how are you doing the log space roughly?
So all the formulas that I wrote in the slides, I think there was only one slide that had the actual equations, but they're written as if they're being done in real space. So we basically treat the log space thing as an implementation detail. So you can think of all the weights as just being positive weights. As long as it's implemented correctly, having weights that are much larger than one isn't a problem. I mean, it's not going to cause overflow if your implementation is done correctly. In terms of modeling, so it turns out to be quite useful for learning. That was the subject of our second paper, because you can think of it as the same benefits that apply to a CRF, where you can amplify runs by just increasing the weight of a single transition in that run. So it tends to make it easier to learn correlations between distant time steps.
Mm-hmm. And the other question is, because these are capable of recognizing all context-free languages, if you improve the n cubed too much, you will have a better parsing algorithm, won't you?
Prove the right. Yeah, I mean it's not better than n cubed.
Yeah, I'm saying that your n cubed is pretty good already, and
Yes,
if
right.
you
So
improve
that
it too much, you'll have to
we think that's an
publish a
optimal lower
paper.
bound. Yeah.
You'll have to publish a paper about parsing if you get too good. Thanks again for the talk.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Are there any more questions for Brian?
I'll ask one more if there's nobody else.
Go ahead.
What would it take to be able to learn WW, do you think?
Yeah, so I think it would require some sort of non-deterministic multi-stack automaton, as opposed to just a non-deterministic PDA that's being abused to simulate multiple stacks. So you need to guess where that middle point between the two W's is. So
Right. So there's only n possible middle points. So it's not a sort of exponential parallelism.
right, yeah, that's right.
So do you have ideas for how that might be overcome?
So using this line of work, yeah, I don't know how far PDAs would take you. Might require reformulating the automaton that you're simulating inside of the stack RNN. So yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that would look like, but it would be modeling some automaton where you, instead of having one stack attached to the PDA, it's like 3 stacks attached to the PDA.
Or maybe n stacks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
One more question, Brian. I was wondering, what to read about this. Are you planning to write a journal paper about all of this, or?
We don't have plans right now to submit a journal paper, but yeah, I mean, this will be my thesis, so.
And your thesis will be completed at the end of this year or later?
End of spring.
Okay, the spring semester next year. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.